Stop what you're doing for just a moment. Right now, try to find yourself, not your thoughts, not your memories, not your body, but the actual you that's supposedly thinking these thoughts. Go ahead, I'll wait. Can't find it, can you? That's because the thing you've been calling yourself your entire life, the thing you defend, worry about, and try to improve, doesn't exist the way you think it does. And this misunderstanding is the root of almost every form of psychological suffering you've ever experienced. What I'm about to show you will either terrify you or liberate you. There is no middle ground, because once you see what I'm pointing to, you can never unsee it. Your entire relationship with reality will shift permanently. This isn't philosophy for philosophy's sake. This is the difference between living in psychological prison and discovering a freedom so profound that ancient sages spent lifetimes trying to communicate it. Alan Watts called it the greatest joke ever played by consciousness on itself. And you're about to get the punchline. We all live with this assumption, every single one of us. We carry around what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, this sense that we are isolated, separate beings housed within the boundaries of our physical bodies, maintaining a consistent identity that travels through time like a passenger in a vehicle. This isn't just your struggle or mine. This is the human struggle. From the moment we learn to say I and me, we begin constructing this elaborate fiction of selfhood. We create a story about who we are, and then we spend the rest of our lives defending that story, maintaining it, and suffering whenever reality threatens to expose its fundamental emptiness. Think about the exhaustion you feel from trying to be consistent. The pressure to maintain your image, your reputation, your sense of who you are. How many times have you caught yourself saying, "That's not like me," or "I would never do that," as if you were defending some sacred territory? This belief in a fixed self becomes a cage. We become so invested in our self-concept that we resist growth, change, and the natural flow of life itself. We cling to outdated versions of ourselves, dragging them along like heavy luggage on a journey that demands we travel light. The businessman continues to define himself by a career that no longer fulfills him. The parent continues to see themselves only as a caregiver long after their children have grown. The student clings to academic identity years after graduation. We mistake these roles, these temporary costumes, for our true nature, and perhaps most tragically, we suffer whenever life inevitably challenges our fixed sense of self. When change comes, as it always does, we experience it as a threat to our very existence. We fight against the natural flow of transformation, creating unnecessary friction and pain. Now, Eastern philosophy, whether we're talking about Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, or Zen, has always understood what Western psychology is only beginning to grasp. The self you think you are protecting doesn't exist as a fixed entity. It never did. The Buddha spoke of anatta, or no self, not as a philosophical concept to debate, but as a direct observation of reality. Look for this permanent, unchanging self, he suggested, and you won't find it. You'll find thoughts, sensations, memories, emotions, all arising and passing away like clouds in an empty sky. But where is the permanent thinker? Where is the unchanging experiencer? The Taoist sages spoke of flowing like water, taking the shape of whatever container life provides, never insisting on maintaining a rigid form. They understood that true wisdom lies not in building a stronger ego, but in recognizing the artificial nature of the ego altogether. Alan Watts, that masterful bridge between Eastern wisdom and Western understanding, spent his entire career pointing to this recognition. He showed us that what we call the self is more like a verb than a noun, not a thing but a process, not a solid entity moving through time, but an ever-changing pattern in the fabric of existence. If this recognition is stirring something in you, if you're feeling that familiar tug of truth that says, yes, there's something here worth exploring, then you're ready for this journey of awakening. This isn't just another philosophy video, it's an invitation to join a community of conscious explorers who are questioning the deepest assumptions about reality itself. Hit that subscribe button, not just to get notified of new content, but to signal to yourself that you're committed to this path of understanding. You're saying yes to dissolving the illusions that keep you trapped in unnecessary suffering. Let's walk this path together. But here's where this gets really interesting and slightly disturbing. The process I'm about to reveal isn't just how you constructed a false self. It's how every single person you've ever met, every relationship you've had, every conflict you've experienced has been built on this same fundamental lie. We're all walking around in a shared hallucination, and we're about to wake up. Let's dive deeper into how this illusion is created and maintained. From the moment you were born, you began receiving messages about who you are. Your parents, teachers, friends, and society at large started telling you stories about your identity. You're shy, you're smart, you're creative, you're difficult. These labels, repeated over time, became the building blocks of what you now consider to be your permanent self. But notice something remarkable. None of these qualities are actually permanent. The shy child can become a confident adult. The difficult teenager can become a compassionate elder. Yet we tend to treat these temporary characteristics as fixed truths about our nature. The mind, being pattern-seeking by nature, takes these scattered experiences and weaves them into a coherent narrative. It creates what we might call the story of me, a psychological biography that gives us a sense of continuity and meaning. But here's the crucial point. This story is constantly being edited, revised, and rewritten, even though we experience it as unchanging. Think about your own life. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even last year? Of course not. Your body has completely replaced most of its cells. Your thoughts have evolved. Your preferences have shifted. Your understanding has deepened. Yet somehow you maintain the illusion that there's an unchanging you at the center of all this change. This fixed self-concept becomes the source of tremendous suffering because it puts us at odds with the fundamental nature of reality, which is constant change and flux. When we believe we are a fixed entity in a changing world, we inevitably experience anxiety, resistance, and conflict. We suffer when people don't see us the way we see ourselves. We suffer when circumstances challenge our self-concept. We suffer when we're forced to behave in ways that don't align with our story about who we are. In essence, we suffer whenever reality refuses to conform to our fictional self-image. The businessman who identifies completely with his career suffers tremendously when he loses his job, not just from the practical challenges, but from the existential crisis of not knowing who he is without his professional identity. The parent who derives their entire sense of self from caregiving experiences profound emptiness when their children leave home. The athlete who builds their identity around physical prowess faces an identity crisis when age or injury limits their abilities. But here's what Eastern wisdom teaches us. This suffering is optional. It's not caused by the external changes themselves, but by our attachment to a fixed sense of self that resists those changes. Now, what I'm about to share with you next is going to sound impossible at first. You might even resist it because it challenges everything you've been taught about personal growth and self-improvement. But stick with me, because this single reframe has the power to end decades of unnecessary psychological suffering in an instant. The Buddhists have a word for this moment. They call it awakening. And it's simpler than you could ever imagine. Here comes the crucial reframe that can liberate us from this unnecessary suffering. What if the self you've been trying to protect and maintain is actually more like a river than a rock? What if you are not a fixed entity experiencing change, but rather the very process of change itself? A river is never the same from moment to moment. The water is constantly flowing. The shape is constantly shifting. The contents are constantly changing. Yet we have no problem recognizing it as the same river over time. We understand that the river's identity lies not in any fixed form, but in the pattern of flow itself. This is exactly what you are, a flowing pattern of consciousness, a dynamic process of experiencing, a verb masquerading as a noun. The self is not something you have, it's something you do. It's not a possession to be protected, but a creative act to be expressed. When you truly grasp this, something remarkable happens. The anxiety about maintaining your self-image begins to dissolve. The fear of change transforms into curiosity about what you might become. The desperate need to defend your personality gives way to the joy of discovering who you are in each moment. Imagine the freedom that comes with this recognition. If you're not a fixed self, then you're not trapped by your past mistakes, your current limitations, or other people's expectations of who you should be. You're free to respond to each situation freshly, without the burden of having to be consistent with some predetermined character. This doesn't mean you become wishy-washy or unprincipled. Rather, you become more authentic because you're no longer performing a role based on an outdated script. You can act from genuine presence rather than from psychological habit. The student discovers they can become the teacher. The follower realizes they can become the leader. The cynic finds they can become the optimist, not because they've changed into someone else, but because they've recognized that they were never confined to any single identity in the first place. Alan Watts often used the metaphor of water to illustrate this point. Water doesn't fight to maintain its shape. It simply flows into whatever form the moment requires. In a cup, it becomes cup-shaped. In a river, it becomes river-shaped. In the ocean, it becomes ocean-shaped. It doesn't lose its essential nature by adapting to circumstances. It expresses its nature through that very adaptability. Eastern philosophy teaches us that life is not about discovering who you are, but about creating who you are in each moment. It's not about uncovering some predetermined essence, but about participating consciously in the ongoing process of becoming. This is why meditation is such a powerful practice. When you sit quietly and observe your thoughts, emotions, and sensations, you begin to see them as temporary events arising and passing away in awareness. You start to recognize that you are not these events. You are the awareness in which they appear. You begin to notice that thoughts come and go without anyone thinking them.
Emotions arise and dissolve without anyone feeling them. Experiences happen without anyone experiencing them. There's awareness, there's experiencing, there's knowing, but there's no separate experiencer standing apart from the experience. This recognition doesn't diminish you, it liberates you. You're not reduced to nothing, you're revealed as everything. You're not less than you thought you were, you're more than you ever imagined. But we're not done yet, because this recognition doesn't just change how you see yourself, it's about to completely transform how you see every other person on the planet. What happens next is what the mystics called the Great Compassion, and it's the inevitable result of this understanding. You're about to discover why enlightened beings throughout history have described this realization as both the death of the ego and the birth of universal love. As this understanding deepens, something beautiful begins to happen. The walls you thought separated you from the rest of existence start to dissolve. If there's no fixed self inside you, then there's no fundamental barrier between you and the world around you. This is where Eastern philosophy becomes truly revolutionary. It's not just offering personal therapy or individual improvement, it's revealing the interconnected nature of all existence. When you see through the illusion of your separate self, you simultaneously see through the illusion of everyone else's separate self. You begin to recognize that the boundaries between self and other, inside and outside, me and you, are conceptual constructions rather than absolute realities. The skin doesn't actually separate you from the environment, it connects you to it. Your breath, your food, your thoughts, your emotions, all arise from your interaction with the world around you. As Alan Watts so eloquently put it, you are not in the universe, you are the universe expressing itself as you. You're not a separate wave on the ocean of existence, you are the ocean waving in a particular way that temporarily calls itself by your name. This recognition naturally gives birth to genuine compassion. When you see that everyone is struggling with the same fundamental illusion, the belief in being a separate fixed self, their difficult behaviors begin to make sense. Their defensiveness, their aggression, their neediness, all stem from the same source, the desperate attempt to protect and maintain an identity that was never real in the first place. The person who cuts you off in traffic isn't just being rude, they're caught in the trance of believing they're a separate self with urgent needs that must be met. The coworker who takes credit for your ideas isn't just selfish, they're desperately trying to shore up a fragile ego that feels constantly threatened. The family member who always creates drama isn't just difficult, they're unconsciously trying to prove their existence through conflict and attention. When you see this clearly, blame and resentment become impossible. How can you hate someone for having the same fundamental misunderstanding that you've been struggling with your entire life? How can you judge someone for suffering from the same illusion that once caused you so much pain? This doesn't mean you become passive or allow others to walk all over you, but your responses come from wisdom and compassion rather than from ego and reactivity. You can set boundaries without building walls. You can say no without saying never. You can protect yourself without attacking others. As you embody this understanding more fully, it begins to affect everyone around you. People sense something different about your presence. There's less agenda, less neediness, less desperation to be seen or understood in a particular way. There's more space, more acceptance, more genuine interest in what's actually happening rather than what should be happening. This creates what systems theorists call a strange attractor, a pattern that naturally draws others toward greater coherence and peace. Without preaching or teaching, without trying to convince anyone of anything, your very being becomes an invitation for others to question their own fixed self-concepts. You become like a tuning fork for authenticity. People around you start to relax their performances, drop their masks, and show up more genuinely, not because you've asked them to, but because your non-defensive presence makes it safe for them to do so. Children who haven't yet fully crystallized their sense of separate selfhood are especially responsive to this quality. They recognize something familiar in your openness, something that reminds them of their original nature before they learn to armor themselves with identity. Here's what nobody tells you about this recognition. Once you truly see it, you can't just file it away as interesting information. It demands expression. It wants to live through you. And the way it expresses itself might surprise you because it's nothing like what you'd expect from spiritual awakening. It's far more ordinary and infinitely more revolutionary. But here's a crucial point that often gets misunderstood. Recognizing the illusory nature of the fixed self doesn't mean you become a formless blob or lose your unique qualities. Quite the opposite. Like a master dancer who has transcended rigid technique, you become more expressive, not less. Buddhism has a beautiful concept called form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Your personality, your preferences, your talents, your quirks, all of these continue to exist and express themselves, but they're held lightly rather than desperately. They're expressions of the moment rather than defenses against eternity. You might still prefer chocolate ice cream to vanilla, but you don't suffer when vanilla is all that's available. You might still excel at certain activities, but you don't collapse when you encounter something you can't do well. You might still have strong opinions, but you hold them like hypotheses rather than dogmas. This is what Zen calls ordinary mind, being fully human while remaining free from the suffering that usually accompanies humanity. It's what Taoism calls Wu Wei, acting in harmony with the natural flow of life rather than against it. And here we arrive at the beautiful paradox that runs through all of Eastern philosophy. In letting go of the self, you find your true self. In releasing your grip on identity, you discover your authentic nature. In dying to who you thought you were, you're reborn as who you really are. This true self, what Hinduism calls the Atman, what Buddhism points to as Buddha nature, what Taoism recognizes as the Tao, is not another identity to be grasped. It's the very graspingless awareness that makes all identities possible. It's not something you have, it's what you are when you stop trying to be anything at all. This is why all the great spiritual traditions ultimately point beyond themselves. They're not offering you a better identity or a more spiritual personality. They're pointing to what you are when all identities fall away, the pure awareness that has always been present, unchanging and eternal, even as all the contents of awareness flow and change. So how do we live from this understanding in practical terms? How do we navigate daily life when we've seen through the illusion of the fixed self? First, we practice what Alan Watts called the wisdom of insecurity. Instead of trying to create certainty and control, we learn to surf the waves of uncertainty with grace and curiosity. We develop what Zen calls don't know mind, the willingness to meet each moment fresh without preconceptions about how things should unfold. Second, we cultivate what Buddhism calls beginner's mind. No matter how much we think we know about ourselves or life, we approach each situation as if we're encountering it for the first time. This keeps us open to surprise, growth, and transformation. Third, we practice presence over performance. Instead of constantly monitoring how we're coming across or whether we're living up to our self-image, we give our full attention to what's actually happening right now. We trust that authentic response will arise naturally when we're genuinely present. Ultimately, seeing through the illusion of the fixed self is an ongoing process of letting go. Letting go of the need to be right, the need to be consistent, the need to be special, the need to be understood in a particular way. It's letting go of the exhausting project of self-improvement and awakening to the simplicity of self-acceptance. But this isn't passive resignation or spiritual bypassing. It's the most courageous act possible, the willingness to live without the security blanket of a fixed identity. It's choosing trust over control, flow over resistance, love over fear. When you truly let go of the illusion of being a fixed self, you don't become nothing, you become everything. You don't lose your individuality, you discover your universality. You don't disappear, you finally appear as what you've always been, the very awareness in which all experience arises and dissolves. And now we arrive at the ultimate paradox, the one that will either make everything I've said click into place, or leave you more confused than when we started, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just the end of this exploration, it's the beginning of your real life, the life you were always meant to live before you got lost in the story of being a separate self. And so we come full circle. The search for the true self ends where it began, with the recognition that there was never anyone searching in the first place. There's just this eternal moment of pure experiencing, appearing as countless temporary forms, including the form that temporarily calls itself by your name. This is what Eastern philosophy has been pointing to for thousands of years. This is what Alan Watts spent his life trying to communicate to Western minds trapped in the prison of excessive selfhood. This is the liberation that awaits anyone willing to question the most fundamental assumption we make about reality, the assumption that we are separate, fixed selves struggling to survive in an alien universe. The truth is far more wonderful. You are the universe experiencing itself subjectively, temporarily forgetting its own nature in order to rediscover it again and again in infinite creativity and endless love. The illusion of being a fixed self was never a mistake to be corrected. It was a game consciousness played with itself, a cosmic hide-and-seek that enriches the universe with the joy of rediscovery. And now, having hidden so completely that you forgot you were playing, you get to experience the supreme delight of remembering who you really are. You are not a separate self lost in an indifferent cosmos. You are the cosmos expressing itself as a beautiful, temporary, ever-changing pattern of awareness. You are not having an experience, you are the experience itself, knowing itself, celebrating itself, loving itself through the magnificent illusion of being you. Welcome home. As we reach the end of this exploration together, I want you to know that this understanding isn't meant to be kept in isolation. Wisdom grows when it's shared, when it moves through community, when it finds expression in our connections with one another. If these insights have touched something real in you, I invite you to join our growing family of consciousness explorers by subscribing to the channel. But more than that, and this is what matters most, share your own experience in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment where you glimpsed this truth, where the boundaries of the self seemed to dissolve, where you felt connected to something infinitely larger than your personal story? Or maybe this is all completely new to you, and you're feeling overwhelmed or skeptical. Whatever your experience, it matters. Your perspective adds to our collective understanding. The comments section isn't just for engagement, it's our Sangha, our spiritual community, where we support each other's awakening. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Your question might open up understanding for others who are afraid to ask. So please, don't just watch and leave. Stay, contribute, become part of this living conversation about what it truly means to be human. The journey of awakening isn't a solo path, it's something we discover together.